let's talk about some of the problems caused by victimization, because there are more problems than just, the direct effects of the victimization itself. So just to sort of give an idea, according to the NCVS, the National Crime Victimization Survey, there are about 20 million victimizations in any given year in the U.S. That is a very broad estimate that is, relatively the same from year to year, but I mean, that's just a general estimate. But just to give you sort of an idea of what we're talking about when we're talking about victimizations, there are a lot of them. So one of the main problems caused by victimization that we can sort of look at a large scale is when we look at economic loss. So there are both product losses and productivity losses, and this is in the hundreds of billions of dollars when we're talking about this. So just for example, system costs, if we look at the justice system costs plus legal costs plus treatment costs, that's about $450 billion a year, which equates to about $1,800 a year per citizen. And so like justice system costs would be the total monetary loss due to things like paying for police, paying for prisons, which prisons alone are about $40 billion a year. So that's kind of when we talk about the justice system. It'd be things like policing, the correctional system, and whatnot. Legal costs would be things like paying for judges, prosecution lawyers, court documents, administrative fees, social workers. That would also sort of fall into that. Treatment costs would be things like hospital treatment, ongoing therapy and psychological treatment, disability benefits. So incorporating all of those things together, the cost of crime then in terms of the actual system itself is about $450 billion a year. And then we look at the individual costs, and of course that's going to be very variable. But the victims may lose earnings, may lose job opportunities. So depending on the effect that it's had on their lives, if they are afraid to leave their house, they don't want to go to work, or they're afraid to go to certain areas, or there's, some kind of lingering effects. There are so many potential reasons for this, but there are these individual costs will be on top of those system costs. And so it's anything direct to the victim that has to do with their earnings or job prospects or things like that. So then, of course, we also, there are the issues of things like stress and PTSD that come from any type of victimization, can cause stress and anxiety long after the fact. And of course, this ties into why we may be doing things like where victims would be like missing work or having to quit jobs or not get a job or whatever. So that does tie into some of the monetary costs. But stress and anxiety themselves are also direct problems caused by crime and direct costs to crime, just non-monetary. So people can suffer from major amounts of stress and anxiety long after a victimization has occurred. And also there are different types of crimes can also result in PTSD. And so these are typically the more severe crimes, so things that involve a lot of violence, possibly sexual assaults, possibly witnessing something. But the PTSD symptoms can be severe. And so we're talking about things like depression, anxiety, self-destructive behavior. And this happens, it's actually fairly common for sexual assault victims. But also victims of any kind of severe trauma like robbery, where there's a lot of violence involved or something like that. So it is not uncommon to have PTSD in a victim population. And then particularly there's stress on juveniles. Juveniles often kind of suffer more damage. If the victimization happens while they're young, it can have a more damaging effect. So juveniles often will become runaways because sometimes they're running away to escape the abuse if the abuse is actually happening in the home, or there's an inability of the family to understand. And so if they are trying to talk about what happened to them or how they were victimized and nobody cares or nobody understands, then that might also result in a runaway. Juveniles also suffer stress disorders, depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, and other psychological problems at a higher rate when they are the victim of a crime. They're also more likely to then have issues as adults. So things like low self-esteem and other psychological issues, higher likelihood of things like homelessness and suicide, as well as also being more likely to be re-victimized as adults. And then there's also the problem of fear, which might tie into some of the sort of psychological issues and PTSD and things like that. But fear itself is kind of a separate problem that's caused. And so there are fundamental life changes that happen after a major victimization. And this affects things like how they live their life, but also behaviorally as well. And so people will become more suspicious, anxious, stressed. They may be afraid to leave their house. They might be, afraid to walk down the street by themselves. They might be afraid to go to work. It depends on what the victimization was and where it was and the severity of it. But fear is very common. Even, if you've had your house burglarized, you might not feel safe in your home anymore. So there's a lot of fear that accompanies victimization long after the fact. And so I have this thing down here. And finally, would you say your fear of crime has increased? And clearly the person has a fear of crime because they won't even open the door for somebody doing a survey. So that's just sort of one example, but like people become very fearful after they've been the victim of a crime because they think it's going to happen again, or they think the person is going to come back again, or they think that, that they're just not safe in general anymore. There's a lot of problems that happen with fear. And then there's not only fear that the direct victims feel, but there's also something that's called vicarious fear. And this is where if somebody either is exposed to violence or observes it in some way, then they will become fearful for themselves. So they don't have to be a direct victim of crime for the crime to have an effect on their level of fear. So if you see crime, and it doesn't even have to be something happening right in front of you. Sometimes people see, violence in the media, or, they hear stories about, a friend of a friend that this happened to, and even that can be enough to cause fear for their own safety or their loved ones or what have you. So that vicarious fear can also be very real. Victimization can also lead to more crime and deviance. There's strong evidence to suggest that people who are crime victims are more likely to commit criminal and deviant acts themselves. So there is this strong link between victimization and antisociality of the victim. So the victim becomes the offender. And we see this, for example, in the cycle of violence. So we look at abused young boys and girls are more likely to engage in violence themselves. So boys and girls who were abused or exposed to violence by adults in their lives, or exposed to weapons as children, they're all more likely to be violent, both as juveniles and in adulthood. And so this becomes sort of a major problem because we can look at that cycle of violence as something that is completely preventable. If we just didn't have this abuse either in the home or wherever the abuse is happening, then this wouldn't cause these problems. But it is also something that is very predictable. And so because if you suffer abuse as a child in some kind of formative developmental years, it's going to cause psychological problems and or result in higher likelihoods of antisociality and violence crime commission. So there's also the problems caused when we look at sort of how this affects children differently. And so if somebody is victimized or abused in childhood, so this has a particularly large impact. But this looks very different depending on the type of abuse. But there's also been studies to show the difference between how females versus how male victims sort of adapt. And so male victims tend to go the route where aggression is turned outwards and they become the abuser. Versus females are more likely to go the route where the aggression that they feel from being victimized is turned inward on themselves. And then this leads to higher levels of self-destructive behavior, so higher levels of stress, PTSD and fear, and but then also to things like self-harm. And then that also sometimes leads to like drug use and alcohol use and things like that. And also, this is more likely to lead to re-victimization because they are more likely to be continue to be destroyed by others. And part of this is because that becomes normal, so that's normalized. But then also because they already have that vulnerability, and then that vulnerability is sort of deep set to the point where it's then abusers can tap into that and they can see that vulnerability, and so they're more likely to engage in relationships with people later on where they are abused, they continue to be abused. So males can go that route and females can absolutely go this route, the sort of outward, turning the aggression outward. But typically we see male victims turn that aggression outward to become the abuser, and that's because it's much more likely that you want that these boys want to be the abuser because they see the abuser as the strong one, the dominant one. And so because society has told them that males are supposed to be the dominant one, then in their mind, if the choice is be a victim or be an abuser, then the abuser is the one with the power. And so that's why we see males in particular tend to kind of go this route to become the abuser themselves, because society has told them that they need to be dominant. And in their mind, if the only choice is be a victim or be an abuser, then the abuser is the one with the dominance, with the power. But we see sort of either of these things happening in children that are victimized young. And sometimes it's a combination as well. You'll have children that become outwardly aggressive, but then also hurt themselves. But we want everybody to get obviously to this healing. That's the overall goal for all victims. But it's a process, and it's not an easy thing to get from being victimized or abused in childhood to that healing result. But that is what we strive for. And just because children are going these other routes doesn't mean we can't circle back to the healing, which is the goal. So some patterns of victimization that we can look at. There are sort of some things that we can look at in terms of like the time and place. So serious violent crime is much more likely to take place at night. Urban, especially within Central City, we're going to see higher rates of theft and violence. Schools also have a lot of victimization, mostly because you have the congregation of teenage and youth males in particular, which is where they're the ones most likely to be committing these crimes, but also the ones most likely to be victims. There's also patterns when we look at the victim's house. So larger homes are more likely to be victimized. Predominantly African American homes are more likely to be victimized. Urban homes are more likely to be victimized. And then those in the West are also more vulnerable to crime compared to other areas of the states. And also people who own their home are less vulnerable. And maybe that's because you think of, if you own your home, you're going to be taking more precautions. And also maybe you're more likely to live in suburban or more rural areas. So there are those other patterns that play in there. Whereas, renters is basically, they probably aren't staying as long either. And they don't have the investment to take care of the house or the property as much as if they owned it themselves. So that pattern also kind of makes sense. But when we look at some of the most common victim characteristics just in general, so gender, with the exception of rape and sexual assault, males are more likely to be the victims, especially of violent crime. We look at age. Young people are more at risk than older people. Elderly victims are particularly susceptible to particular types of crimes, so things like fraud and scams. That's much more likely to target elderly victims. But all other types of crimes, young people are more at risk. When we look at socioeconomic status, the poor are more likely to be victims of violent and property crime. Wealthy are more likely to experience personal theft like pickpocketing or purse snatching or things like that. And marital status, never married, are most at risk. This probably ties into age, though, which we know is a very relevant factor. Widows and widowers have the lowest risk, but that, again, is probably related to age. Race and ethnicity, African Americans are more likely than whites to be victims of violent crime, but violent crime has been on the decrease for both groups, so that's relevant. And when we look at victim offender patterns, crimes tend to be intraracial, meaning that the victim and the offender are of the same race. But females are more often victimized by somebody that they know. Males are more often victimized by strangers, related to the types of crimes committed against males versus females, though. So because females are more likely to be, it's victims of sexual assault, things like that, where it's much more likely to be a known perpetrator. What that means then is that in general, crimes are still committed, tend to be committed much more often by a known assailant. But if there are going to be stranger perpetrated crimes, they're more likely to be committed against a male victim. Overall, though, when we look at non-fatal personal crimes, at least more than half of all of these non-fatal personal crimes are committed by a known assailant. So while stranger crimes are more likely to happen against male victims because of the types of crimes that males are more likely to be the victim of, but it's still the case that it's a higher likelihood that you're going to be offended against by somebody that you know.